Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special webinar with us today. I am your hostess, Beth Barany, and today we're going to be talking about the 10 power techniques for starting your scenes. And with us today is a special instructor, Bonnie Johnston. So glad to have you here.
So glad to be here.
Yay! So just so everyone knows they're in the right place, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about scenes, and specifically scene openings. What do they all have in common? And how can you be confident that the first sentence or two of your scene will hook your readers and reel them in, right? That's our goal. So Bonnie, today, she's going to answer these points. She's going to talk about the 4-part structure of a scene. She's going to talk about the scenes, how the scene's rising action, climax, and resolution unfold from the opening. She's going to talk about how do you know if you started your scene in the right place. I know that's a problem for a lot of us. Also, the center of her presentation today is 10 powerful scene starting techniques that will grab your reader's attention and draw them into the scene's action. And then lastly, you will get a sneak peek into her amazing course called Manuscript Magic, which is a masterclass on revision and editing. And I understand much of the content today that Bonnie will be sharing, some of it is from Manuscript Magic, but also a nice handful of it is from is new content that she's never shared in a course before. So that's very exciting. So for those of you who don't know me, and this is your first time here, I'm Beth Barany. Whoops, that's me futzing with my mic. Okay, I'll start again. I'm Beth Barany. I am an award-winning novelist, master neurolinguistic practitioner, and a certified creativity coach for writers. I specialize in helping writers experience clarity so they can write, revise, and proudly publish their novels to the delight of their readers. And with me here today is Bonnie Johnston. She is a writing mentor and an award-winning author with a passion for teaching fiction writers how to increase the emotional impact of their stories to turn readers into fans. She's the instructor for the course Manuscript Magic, and she blogs at Write Smarter, Not Harder, where you can download her free book, Editing for Story. And lastly, she's also the author of the 30-Day Novel Workbook, the 30-Day Romance Novel Workbook, that's awesome, and the Writer's Guide to Getting Organized. I'm so glad that you could be here with us today, and I'm really looking forward to diving into your content.
Thank you for having me, Beth.
So can you start us with the slides, open up the slides for us? And while you do that, I just want to welcome formally everybody here. I know some of you are coming from across the United States and around the world. If you want to go ahead and pop into the chat what you are writing, what kind of books are you writing, and where you are hailing from. And Bonnie, do I need to give you permission or anything? Are you able to?
I apologize. My slides just disappeared. They were there when we were rehearsing, and I just got to go find them. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. You're welcome to close your video. There you go. Oh, there she goes. That's awesome. And while she fiddles with that, that's so cool. Let's see. Natasha is here writing cozy mysteries from Vancouver, BC. Welcome, Natasha. Awesome. Love cozy mysteries. Holly is from Colorado writing historical mysteries for children, which are awesome. Hi, Holly. So glad to see you. Jay is from Australia and writing commercial fiction presently in developmental editing. Cool. Irene is here writing middle grade fantasy from Berkeley. Yay, Berkeley, California. I should just say that I'm in Oakland and Bonnie's in the Central Valley. Lindsay is near San Francisco, writing contemporary romance. Awesome. And Carrie is, says, hi everyone, my name is Carrie and I write sci-fi romances and I'm from Northwestern Michigan. So cool. And we have, hi Brianna. Brianna is writing fantasy and is from Oregon, USA. Hugh, hi Hugh. Hugh is from Brooklyn, New York, and he writes fantasy. I feel like I'm in some game show. And we have J.M. Haas from Walnut Creek, California, writing short stories. Wonderful. And Irene is writing memoirs in Florida. Oh, fabulous. And I should say that I write young adult fantasy, fantasy romance or paranormal romance, not really sure. And now I'm currently writing science fiction mystery. And I know Bonnie writes romance, right, Bonnie? Historical romance. You've written and fantasy and urban fantasy.
Yes.
Fabulous. Great. And just a few logistics right before we begin. You're all on mute, and there will be time for questions at the end. We will go for about an hour and a half to 2 hours because there's so much content. I understand if you have to leave early, not a problem. This is being recorded, and the replay will be available to everyone. And I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So, and for some of you who have worked with us in the past and are familiar with Zoom, maybe can help folks out if they have Zoom, any kind of Zoom technical questions. Just a few more welcomes. We have Maggie from Australia writing urban fantasy. Wonderful. Several people from Australia. That's so great. And then we have Nicole. Nicole Melissa Green is my pen name. And Nicole writes intergalactic culinary thrillers and speculative fiction minis. And she also has plans to get back to sorry if I say this wrong, scriptural poems. Fabulous. Great. Well, I'm so glad to meet everyone and so glad that everyone is here with us today. And I'm very excited to dive into this content with Bonnie. So Bonnie, are you ready?
I'm ready to go.
All right, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. First, I'm just going to give you guys a little overview of scene structure from the macro view, just as kind of a reminder of where scene openings fit in and how they unfold into the rest of the scene. You can think of scenes as little stories in themselves. Structurally, they have a beginning, they have a middle, which will include not just the rising action, but also the climax, and then they have an ending. And we're going to focus today on how you find a great beginning. So when you look at the beginning of a scene, it has to do a few things. It has to hook the reader. It has to orient the reader in the story world. If you're in limited point of view, this means you're establishing who your point of view character is. It needs to establish an emotion, and it needs to introduce conflict and stakes. Now, the middle of the scene is going to show different things. It's going to show how the situation that you've established in the beginning of the scene gets destabilized. Whatever's happening in the beginning of the scene, things need to start falling apart as your character tries to get what they want and they fail to get it. That's how you escalate conflict. The kinds of escalations you get are either usually the situation gets worse for that character, or the stakes get higher for that character, or both as a result of the problems they're having in the scene. And each escalation of conflict ends with a yes but, a no, or a no and. And what I mean by that is maybe yes, the character gets what they're trying to get, but it creates an unintended consequence that they then have to deal with. Or no, the character just doesn't get what they want and they have to try something else. Or no and, which means not only does the character not get what they want, they also have an unintended consequence as a result of trying. And then finally, the middle of the scene needs to shift the reader's shift the emotion that you established in the beginning of the scene or intensify it. So you can have the middle of your scene can either take the character, the point of view character or the focal character from the emotion that the beginning establishes and intensify it all the way through the scene. So they go from being annoyed to being really angry, or they shift it so that maybe the character starts out being annoyed and at the end of the scene they're really upset or really sad. And then finally, the end of the scene also needs to do a few things. It needs to show that a character's attempts to resolve conflict end in a big yes, yes, but no, or no, and. And we very seldom give our characters a yes. We want to give them yes, but, no, or no, and until we get to the end of the story, because that's how we keep escalating conflict at the scene level. The ending of a scene also needs to establish the character's new emotion or establish that increase in emotional intensity that has been progressing through the scene. And finally, the ending of your scene needs to create suspense so that the reader has to find out what happens next. We want the scene ending to make the reader curious about something so that they feel like they have to read the next scene. And it can be a very subtle thing. It doesn't have to be a big question that we're raising. So just to give you broad strokes, you're going to have your scene opening, and we're going to talk about 10 types that get used all the time. They are not the only 10 ways to open a scene, but they're the ones you see over and over and over again because they're very effective. And your opening is going to introduce all your character elements. Then you're going to have that series of try-fail cycles like we talked about, where the character tries something and they don't get what they want, or they get what they want and it creates a problem for them. A scene can have as few as one try-fail cycle, or it can have as many as you need it to be. If it's a massive scene at the climax, it could have 20 or 30 try-fail cycles. So this 3 here is really just to kind of give you a sense of the structure of the middle, rather than to tell you, yes, please put 3 try-fail cycles in every scene. And also how many you have can depend on how big you are. How big you want to make them. For example, if the character is trying to do something really ambitious and massive that's really hard, that try-fail cycle might take up the whole scene and you might just have 1. Or if they're trying several little things in the scene, you might have 5 or 6. And then there's 8 types of endings, and we're not really going to touch on those today. And again, just like the beginnings, they're not the only 8 ways to end the scene, but they are 8 ways that you see over and over and over again, because they create that suspense we talked about and make the reader curious about how what's going to happen, how the story is going to unfold, so they want to read the next scene. And of course, you can, if it's appropriate, include what's called a sequel. If you're into the old-timey schema of writing craft that was made popular by Dwight Swain and Jack Bickham and some of their students. Basically, a sequel is a kind of scene. It's just a reaction scene. Today we don't tend to call them sequels. We tend to call them reflection scenes, where the character basically in the last scene had something really bad happen to them, and they just have a very short scene where they take a moment and they meditate on what happened or reflect. They make a decision. They choose between the 2 best options. That's their dilemma. And then they make a decision that moves them into the next scene. So please don't be confused by that word sequel. It just means a scene where the character is reflecting on something for a little bit. So before we get into great scene openings, I just want to say a few words on how you know if you've started your scene too soon. If your scene opening feels really slow, if your scene opening has no conflict in it, if your scene opening has a lot of exposition where you're explaining a lot of things, there's a really good chance that you started too soon. And we're going to talk about a little bit about how to pick the right point when we talk about the 10 different types of openings. But I just want you to know, whenever you have a scene and you feel like things aren't moving forward, that's a really good indication that you've started too soon. How you can tell if you started too late is usually you feel like the scene is fine, but your readers are really confused. They start reading the scene opening and they're like, wait, where are we? What's happening? Like, did something happen between the scene and the last scene? And that's usually a really good sign in terms of reader feedback that you've started the scene too late in the action and you need to back up a little bit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what makes a great scene opening. A great scene opening is going to draw the reader in. And of course, like I said, there's a lot of ways you can open a scene, but there are 10 that you see used all the time because they work. They're very effective, and you've probably seen every single one of them. You have probably intuitively used every single one of them, and you might just not have a name for them at this point in time. So why do these 10 types of scene openings work? They work because they are all suspense hooks. What's a suspense hook? It's something that piques your reader's curiosity and makes them want to keep reading by raising a question. So each suspense hook doesn't have to raise a big question. It just has to make the reader curious. It can be something very small that just feels off, or a little tiny contradiction, or something that the character notices that seems out of place. Those things can all be suspense hooks. Maybe the character's boyfriend gives her a funny glance at the beginning of the scene, and we're all wondering, hey, what does that mean? It seemed like they were getting along in the last scene. That counts as a suspense hook because it makes us wonder something. So here's the 10 most common types we're going to talk about. Starting right at the beginning of the action, starting in medias res, starting with a link to the previous scene, something that connects the current scene to what happened before, a summary of a previous or intervening action. For example, if a day has passed since the previous scene, you might want to say something that lets the reader know, like a day later, things have gone completely wrong. You can start with a big promise. You can start with setting an action, and when we do that, we always want the action of the setting to be affecting a character. You can start by introducing a character in an interesting way. You can start the scene with dialogue, but it's important that the dialogue make the reader curious about something. It's not enough just to start it with dialogue. You can start with the character or the narrator making some sort of observation, maybe something funny or philosophical or wise, but again, it needs to raise a question. Or you can use the zoom in, and you see this a lot in film. This doesn't get used as much anymore because it is an omniscient narration technique, and deep point of view is so popular right now. But there are clever ways to use it, and we're going to talk about that. So starting at the beginning, this is where you just simply start exactly where the important action of the scene starts. For example, Penny hurried into the grocery store break room and slipped on her apron seconds before she was supposed to clock in. So nothing important happened before that. Before that, Penny was just traveling to the store. We skip the boring traveling part and we start right when the interesting stuff happens, where she runs in late and just barely makes it in to clock in. And this raises questions. Why is Penny cutting it so close? Did something happen to delay her, or is she the kind of person who's always late? What would happen if she made it seconds after she was supposed to clock in? Excuse me. Would she have gotten in trouble? And did anyone notice that she's rushing in, or is she going to get away with it? And you'll notice these are not huge questions. These questions are not like bombs that you're dropping on the reader. They're just something to make the reader a little bit curious about what's going on with the character. The second type of opening that you see over and over again, in medias res, which is Latin for starting in the middle of things rather than starting at the beginning of the action. This is simply where you start in the middle of the scene action after something significant has already happened. You want to be careful with this because if you start too late after that significant event, you confuse the reader. So it's important to make sure that this type of suspense hook really makes clear who the character is and where they are so the reader can catch up quickly. Here's an example. Alex lunged sideways, barely avoiding the fireball that splattered against the brick wall behind him. And this raises the questions, who's throwing the fireball? Why did they throw it at Alex? Did he do something to deserve it? And will Alex be able to avoid the next fireball? And again, except for that last one about him maybe getting fried the next time a fireball gets thrown, these are all really small questions. But again, they engage the reader's curiosity, and like now the reader's wondering multiple things. And if you can have a suspense hook make the reader wonder 10 things, that's even better. So the third type of opening, linking to a previous scene, and this is where you just remind the reader of something that happened before in the story, something that they saw that's relevant to the current scene. And you can do it pretty subtly. You don't have to say 3 weeks ago, Mike and Sam had a fight. You can just remind the reader by showing something relevant to the thing that happened before. So in this case, apologize or pretend they hadn't fought. Mike hesitated by the classroom door, wondering if Sam was still mad. So that that little hint reminds the reader, oh yeah, Mike and Sam had a fight, but it doesn't hit the reader over the head with a rehash of what happened. And it also raises some questions. What is Sam going to do if he hasn't forgiven Mike yet? Is Mike going to apologize? And what's Mike going to do if Sam won't accept his apology? Or what is Mike hoping for? Maybe Mike is hoping that Sam just won't talk to him and that he doesn't have to deal with it. We don't know. So when you use this type of scene opening, you're also reminding the reader of the emotions they experience when you're reading the previous scene. And this is a really great technique. If you had something that happened maybe 5 scenes ago, and you don't ever want to have too much of a disconnect between the emotions of different scenes. So referring to this fight and just reminding the reader, hey, Mike and Sam are mad at each other, just brings that emotion from the past scene into the beginning of the present scene, so then everything else in the scene is going to unfold from that old anger. And it just gives the reader a greater sense of continuity in terms of what's happening in your characters' emotional lives. Okay, the fourth type is a little bit similar to the previous. It's starting the scene with a summary of previous or intervening action. And the difference is, instead of reminding the reader of something they have seen, which is what the previous suspense hook did, now we're letting the reader know in a really quick way that something happened that they missed. It was something between scenes. So we're letting the reader know about events that have happened since the previous scene. And usually when you use this technique, you want to use it when those events are something that aren't really going to be interesting if you show the reader, but the reader still has to know about them. So if you've got 4 months passing by between one scene and the next, and you just want to quickly bring the reader up on the progress of what's been going on in those 4 months, you can do that. So here's our example. 4 months went by faster than Jenny had expected. Every time she managed to fix one problem with her balance bar routine, another one cropped up. She'd practiced her heart out, but she still didn't feel ready for Olympic tryouts. And this raises questions. What kind of problems is Jenny having? Why is she having problems? Is her lack of confidence causing her to make mistakes? And what's it going to take for her to get ready for tryouts? Is she going to fail on her goal of making the Olympic team? And I just want to point out here that we didn't just give the reader a summary of facts. We gave them to the reader with a strong emotion. Jenny's worried. She's worried that she is going to completely blow it. But we haven't bored the reader with 4 months of Jenny failing over and over again. We've just given them a quick summary that brings them up to speed so we can get into the significant thing, which is going to be what Jenny's going to do about the fact that she's not getting better fast enough. So the fifth type of scene hook or scene opening, the big promise. This is where you basically make the reader a promise about what's coming in the scene. And this is often done with a first-person narrator. It could be done with a third-person viewpoint of view if we're really deep in the character's mind. So it almost feels like we're in the character's thoughts as they're thinking, or you can use it with omniscient. It's a little bit harder to use when you're in shallow point of view unless there's a clear narrator. Here's the example. If I had known what Carla was going to do in 5th period, I would have cut class. Better detention than total humiliation. And that raises questions. What did Carla do? And why was being there when it happened so humiliating to the narrator? And we're also making the reader a promise. If we open the scene with this and then we never tell them what happened in 5th period and why Carla was humiliated, the reader is going to feel cheated. So you only want to use this big promise when you can make good on it, when the scene is about the unfolding of whatever it is you're promising, so that the reader knows something is coming. They're not exactly sure what it is, but they know it's going to be big. So they're glued to the page. You've created suspense for them. They want to know what was so awful that happened in 5th period. And then you tease them a little bit with it. By the time they get to the scene climax and they find out, they're ready to know. They're really curious about it. So opening with setting in action is the 6th technique. You want to start your scene with a description of the setting in action, and this is really important. You need to show or imply how that action is going to affect at least one character. If you do not show how what's happening in the setting is going to affect someone, or at least imply that it's going to affect someone, the reader doesn't get emotionally engaged. It's just another setting description that they start to skim. So here's our example. With an earth-shaking crack, a massive chunk of ice slid down the face of the glacier towards Rishi's kayak. And that, of course, raises the questions of what's going to happen when the chunk of ice hits bottom, and is Rishi going to be able to paddle fast enough to avoid being hit, and will the impact overturn his kayak? This could be happening in the middle of a story where we know who Rishi is, or it could happen on the first page of a story where we don't know who Rishi is. If we don't know who Rishi is, seeing him put in immediate danger is going to make us worry and care about him a little bit more. And if we're in the middle and we already know him, then we're even more invested in what happens when that chunk of ice slides down the glacier. If we love Rishi, we're going to be worried. And if we hate Rishi, we hope it's going to fall on him. The 7th suspense hook, or type of scene opening, is to introduce a character, but it's really important that you introduce the reader to the character in a compelling way. And again, because this is a suspense hook, we want to make sure that whatever you do to introduce the reader to this character, that it raises a question in the reader's mind about that character. For example, Bobby James was like a sunburn. I loved hanging out with him, and I always regretted it the next day. And this raises the questions, why is Bobby James like a sunburn? What kinds of things does the narrator do when she hangs out with him? And why doesn't she say no to him if she knows she's going to regret it the next day? The 8th suspense hook, starting the scene with dialogue that creates suspense. Make me. Debbie glared at her bratty little brother. If you don't, I'll tell Mom about the thing. So this raises the question, what is Debbie trying to make her little brother do? And what is she going to tell Mom if little brother doesn't knuckle under and do what she wants? And of course, this also raises a question about their relationship while establishing that it's not the best relationship. It's kind of a typical older sister, little brother relationship, but clearly Debbie's got some leverage. And then we have to wonder, has she always had that leverage? Is this something new? Is this something that happens typically where she's constantly blackmailing him about the thing, whatever that is? So again, it's not enough to open with dialogue. The dialogue really needs to raise some questions about what's happening, but maybe also about the characters too, if you can. The 9th way of opening a scene, using an observation as a suspense hook. You've seen this before, I'm sure, where you start the scene with an observation, either by an omniscient narrator or by the point of view or focal character of the scene. And the observation, ideally, you want it to be philosophical or funny or wise, or all of the above if you can manage it. For example, there are 2 kinds of people in this world, the smart ones and the ones who disagree with me. Not only does this opening a little bit funny, it also tells you something really important about the character who's saying it to you. Questions that it raises. Is the narrator smart, or do they just think they're smart? And how often do people really disagree with this narrator? Is he blowing something out of proportion, or do we have an argumentative or disagreeable person here that we're listening to? Is the narrator someone, or excuse me, are we going to meet someone who agrees with the narrator? Probably not. We're probably about to meet someone who disagrees with the narrator, and now we have to wonder why, what they're going to disagree about. And the 10th suspense hook that you can use to start a scene is the zoom in. This is where you start with a big picture and you zoom in on a specific character. For example, if you visit the modest blue-green planet between Venus and Mars, on the surface you'll find a stretch of land shaped much like a boot, wherein sits a city known as Rome. Max lived in a pensione near the Appian Way with his parents and his sister. So we started out by looking at the planet Earth, and we zoomed into Italy, then we zoomed into Rome, and then we zoomed into Max. And you see this all the time in movies. Pulling it off in fiction is a little bit harder, but it can be done. And actually, we're going to get into a couple of examples later where someone does this in a brilliant way. I really love the way Cage Baker does this. But for now, let's just look at the questions raised. So we have to wonder, why are we zooming in on this particular person out of all the people on Earth? Because basically, when you start with Earth, like the context is all of the billions of people who live here, and we zoom into this one person, which implies that person is very special. And so we have to wonder, why is Max special? How does he fit into the cosmic scheme of things? And when you're zooming in, you're often putting the character or whatever you're zooming in on in a broader context. And so you want to think about how that is going to affect the reader's interpretation of that character. You're basically telling them, here is the universe in which this character operates. Now let's zoom in and see why it's so interesting that they're operating in this system in a different way than everyone else. So we do want to mix these up. Like most writers, you're going to have favorite techniques that you rely on heavily when you write. Maybe you don't realize it because it's hard to see what your literary tics are in your own work. But your readers or your critique partners or your editor might point them out to you. So when you're using the same type of scene opening or any other technique for that matter over and over again, You're probably really good at it and it intuitively appeals to you, but it can make your scenes feel a little predictable or repetitive. And readers might not be able to put their finger on why your story is starting to feel predictable or repetitive, but they are going to notice. So once you've written a story, or when you're plotting it out and trying to figure out how each scene is going to open with its own hook, pay attention to how you're opening each scene. And when you find a sequence of scenes that all open in the same way, you want to look for opportunities to rewrite those using other types of suspense hooks. And I just want to say that if you are ever stuck, the way that I use this list all the time, I don't refer to it with every scene that I plan. I just start the scene organically, try and figure out where the most logical, interesting place is to start the scene. But when I go back and edit, whenever I have a scene opening that doesn't feel right, or that I feel like it could be better, maybe it's a little blah, I will go through and I will try and write an opening to that scene using each of these 10 suspense hooks, and then I'll see which one I like best. And I might have to adjust the transition between the scene hook to the rest of the scene, but that's cool because I know that I have found the best possible way to open that scene. And also you can take these multiple versions and show them to your husband or show them to your critique partners and see which one makes them laugh or see which one makes them go like, ah, where's the rest of this? So now I'd like to spend a little time breaking down scene openings. Remember, there were certain things the scene openings have to do. They have to orient us in the story world. They have to tell us whose point of view we're in, if we're in a point of view, or if we're an omniscient, make it clear that we're hearing from the narrator. We want to look at the suspense hook. What is your opening doing to raise curiosity so that the reader wants to keep reading? What emotion does your opening establish? What conflict does it introduce? And what stakes does it introduce? So now we're going to look at some examples of really great scene openings from different types of fiction and look at these 6 points and see how each of these scene openings does these things. So this is from a really funny book, a first-person book from a British author named Kate Locke. It's an urban fantasy set in an alternate world where Queen Victoria is still alive because she's a vampire. And it's a really fun book if you like that kind of thing. We have a scene in it that opens with, killing her would be too kind. She looks so at home here in this lovely room with its sage green walls and white woodwork. Gauzy curtains with little green leaves covered the blinds at the windows, and a cream, taupe, and sage rug sat in the middle of the hardwood floor. The furniture was white as well, but the focal point of the room was the enormous four-poster bed on which my sister sat, dressed in white knee-length bloomers and a loose shirt, legs crossed like a yogi, smiling like a fucking idiot. So this opening has a really strong emotion. It opens with something that raises your curiosity because we don't know who the her is that it would be too kind to kill. And it does a really interesting thing here with setting. We start with this question, so now we're captivated. We have to know who's sitting there. Instead of saying it was my sister sitting on the bed, the author then says, oh, but she looks so at home here. And she uses the room to characterize her sister before we get to the point where we actually see the sister sitting on the bed. So in terms of orientation, we know that we're in a well-appointed bedroom where the narrator's sister is sitting on the bed cross-legged. By the end of that paragraph, you know exactly what's happening in the scene and where everything is. Point of view, it's the main character of the book, and the voice comes through very strongly in terms of her personality. The suspense hook is the observation type. And it raises the question, what's her sister doing, sitting and smiling like, quote, a fucking idiot? The fact that the sister is just sitting there watching when she knows that the narrator's coming in and is furious suggests that the sister's expecting her and is up to something. She doesn't look surprised at all. So this is a conflict that at least one of the people involved already is expecting. There's a very strong emotion in this scene opening, anger. The conflict that it introduces, the conversation that the narrator is about to have with her sister is definitely not going to be jovial. They are going to fight about something. And in terms of stakes, we're not sure what's at stake, but whatever it is, it's high enough stakes that the narrator is thinking in terms of killing her sister. So whatever the conflict is, it is not trivial. Something important is on the line. And she did this in just a couple of paragraphs. This is a scene opening from The Last Oracle by James Rollins, a very different kind of novel. It's a historical thriller. Gray cradled the girl in his arms and hurried across the front yard. The crisp September night contrasted with the feverish heat of the child. He felt the burn of her skin through his shirt. Her fever had spiked while laboring on her artwork, and she had collapsed when Gray had pulled the charcoal from her fingers. She was conscious, but her eyes stared blankly, and her limbs were oddly stiff and wooden, as if he were carrying a life-size doll. Her waxy features heightened the comparison. Gray touched her face, noting the fine delicacy of her tiny eyelashes. Who could do this to a child? So one thing that's very striking here, we do have a little setting information here. We know that he's in the front yard of some building. We know that it's a crisp September night, so it's probably a little chilly because it's contrasting with the feverish heat of the child. We also have this image of the child as being very doll-like and kind of broken looking. So we know that she's in serious trouble. It raises a lot of anxiety for the reader. And we end with a sense of outrage. Who could do this to a child? So if we look at orientation, the main character is simply carrying a very sick child to a front yard, probably to get help. The point of view character is a covert agent named Gray, and because this scene, like all the scenes we're looking at, were pulled from the middle of stories, and the reason we did that is because the very first scene in your story, its opening has to accomplish some extra things that we're going to talk about later. But right now, I just want you to understand the basics of scene openings. The suspense hook it uses is in medias res. He's immediately, something happened before that caused the child to look like she was going to collapse, and he took the charcoal out, and he did a very good job of just letting us know what happened before the scene started without making it obtrusive. We're wondering, is the child going to die before Gray can help her, and who made her sick? That last line is also a suspense hook. It implies that this is not just some sort of random accident. Someone deliberately did this to this child. The emotion of this opening is shock and horror, and the illness making her seem more fragile by reminding Gray of a doll kind of drives that horror home. We feel so bad for her. She's so defenseless and so helpless. The conflict, he's got to try and find someone who can treat the child in time. And at this point in the scene, we don't even know if he knows what's wrong with her. And the stakes, of course, are very high. They're the child's life. This is a scene from one of my favorite authors, V.E. Schwab, A Darker Shade of Magic. And this is a scene opening that happens somewhere in the middle of the book. Kell couldn't stop the blood. It soaked through his shirt front, the fabric clinging to him as he ran, stumbled, through the narrow maze of streets that gathered web-like in the corners of Red London. He clutched at his pocket to make sure the stone was safe, and a thrum ran through his fingers as they felt it there. He should have run for the river, should have pitched the talisman into the glittering isle and let it sink. He should have, but he hadn't, and that left him with a problem. And the problem was catching up. So in terms of orientation, we can see that this person is stumbling through a maze of streets in a version of London. In this story, there are multiple versions of London, and the author very cleverly let us know which one he was in. Kell, we're in his point of view. He's obviously very level-headed. We can see that he's bleeding, so we know he's in trouble. The suspense hook, this is again in medias res, and this one gets used so many times because it's so effective in pulling readers in naturally, starting with action. So the questions it raises: will Kell bleed to death before he gets help? What magic in the stone causes his fingers to thrum when he touches it? Will he throw it away as he knows he should? What will happen if he keeps it? And who's chasing him? So there are two emotions in this opening: fear and regret. The predominant emotion is actually not fear. Fear is in there, but the predominant notion is regret. The author spent a lot of this, the greater portion of this, having Kell think about the stone, that presumably it's implied that the stone is what got him shot or hurt, so that he's like bleeding to death as he's stumbling through the streets. And all he's thinking about is not, oh my God, am I going to get to safety? He's thinking about, I should have thrown it away. I wish I'd thrown it away. Why didn't I throw it away? And now I'm going to be in trouble when this whoever's chasing me catches up. And I just want to say that your scene opening can have multiple emotions, but you want there to be one that is primary, one that infuses the whole scene. And if there's secondary emotions in there, that's great, but you want to make sure you hit that primary emotion really hard in the opening of the scene. In terms of conflict, Kel has to get away from whoever is chasing him before he bleeds to death. And he seems to have been bleeding for a while because he's stumbling. The stakes are his life, and maybe more depending on what the stone turns out to be. The fact that he could be dying, and he might be spending his dying thoughts on his regret that he didn't get rid of the stone before someone else caught up to him and got their hands on it, tells you that the stone is going to be pretty important in the story. From Nightmare Mountain by Cage Baker, who's a wonderful writer. There once was a poor man, and he had a daughter. He wouldn't for a second have admitted that he was poor. He owned a 50-acre almond ranch in San Jose, after all. He came of fine stock from the South, and all his people on both sides had owned property before the war. It was true their circumstances had been somewhat reduced in the days following the capitulation at Appomattox. It was true he and all his kin had been obliged to flee persecution and head west. But they were people of account, make no mistake about it. One of the things I love about this is that even though this is being told to you by an omniscient narrator, this is not from a character's point of view. But this description of the man and who he is really captures his personality and his attitude. We can tell that the narrator is explaining to you who this man is as he would explain it to you. And I just love that. I think she did a brilliant job of that. So the orientation, this opening tells you that this is going to be a story about a proud but poor Southern man who owns an almond ranch near San Jose sometime after the Civil War. That's a lot of information you got in just one paragraph. In terms of point of view, we are in an omniscient narrator's point of view. But like I said, the narrator's talking about the man in a way that echoes his voice. So we get a chance to kind of feel what this character is going to be like before we find out what's going on with him. The suspense hook, this is the zoom in I was talking about. This is an incredibly clever way to use a zoom in. We didn't zoom in terms of setting. We zoomed in terms of a situation. We started with, there once was a poor man and he had a daughter. That sentence could apply to so many people. But after that first sentence, she immediately zooms in and tell you, well, who is this particular poor man that we're going to follow? And it raises questions. Why is he poor even though he owns an almond ranch? You'd think he would actually have a lot of money if he's got all this land and he's producing almonds that he could sell. Like, what happened? And how is his poverty going to affect his daughter? The fact that she starts the story, Cage Baker starts this scene immediately letting you know that not just that this was a poor man, but he had a daughter. And then we describe the poor man's attitude toward life. It's implied that whatever is happening with his daughter, it is not going to be good, and it is probably the result of his mindset and however he behaves as a result of it. We also wonder, has this family been persecuted, and how has this family been persecuted? We know that he had to flee the South after the South lost, but we don't know why, what was being done to him, and by who. And also we have to wonder, will this family's misfortune continue? And the emotions in here are pride and resentment. And again, I want to look at primary and secondary emotions. The resentment comes through in his voice in terms of how he talks about the fact that, sure, all these bad things happen to his family. But the pride is really predominant because the main impact of this opening paragraph is to let you know it doesn't matter how bad this man's situation is, he is never going to admit he's poor, and he is going to insist with his dying breath that he's good people. His family was good people on both sides. They don't deserve whatever's going on with them. So he's very proud about who he is, even though his circumstances are not what he thinks they should be. The conflict that this introduces, This is a main character who's been ruined, but he's still keeping up appearances. And just knowing that about him suggests that this whole story is going to focus on problems that he and his daughter have as a result of him being unwilling to admit how things really are. And then the stakes, the fact that they introduced the daughter right after the fact that he's poor, lets you know that he's got to protect his daughter without a lot of resources. Whatever it means to him to be a father, he is going to be scraping by while he's doing it. And she's going to have to deal with his pride making things harder. So you can tell from this opening paragraph that this is not going to be a story about a happy family. You might be a Jenna Ivanovich fan. This is from her book High Five. There could be a perfectly good explanation for the Terry thing, I said to Mary Lou. Yeah, like he's a prick. That's one of the things I like about Mary Lou. She's always willing to believe the worst about anyone. Of course, it's easy to believe the worst about Morelli. He's never cared a whole lot about public opinion and has never made much of an attempt to improve his rogue reputation. And in the past, his reputation was well deserved. Okay, so this scene, unlike the others that we've looked at, the scene opening continues from the previous scene, so there was no orientation needed. And occasionally you'll have a scene where the characters don't change location, and who's there doesn't change, but the author chose to break at a tense point and then skip over to another part of the conversation or skip over to another part of the action. Sometimes you want to do that and it's fair game. When you're doing it, you do not have to re-explain that they are standing in front of the police station or whatever the characters were doing in the past, because the reader is going to immediately, after that last scene ends on a suspense hook or in a suspenseful moment, is immediately going to want to find out how the rest of the conversation went, and they just want you to tell them. So this is one of those few times when you don't need to worry about setting in the opening of the scene. And of course, the point of view character is Stephanie Plum, and that's again going to be clear to the reader based on how the last scene ended, so we don't have to establish that. This is a dialogue type suspense hook. And I just want to point out again, it's not just dialogue, it's dialogue that raises a question. When she says when Stephanie says there could be another explanation for this thing, we immediately have to wonder if there is another explanation. Is this kind of a misunderstanding? Is Morelli actually up to no good? Did he do something awful to Terry? And will Terry forgive him? And the main emotion of this, there again are two emotions. There's a little bit of annoyance in there, but the main emotion in there is humor. The bulk of this opening is Stephanie Plum being really pleased by the fact that Mary Lou is just completely unwilling to give Morelli any sort of benefit of the doubt. And it's the description of Terry's attitude followed by the description of Morelli in humorous terms about like what a bad boy he is that really pulls the reader into the rest of the scene. And it also tells the reader, yeah, probably there is not going to be some sort of misunderstanding. He probably did do what he was supposed to have done to Terry. The conflict in this, Terry's obviously mad at Morelli and unwilling to assume that he might have not have intended to mess with her. And Stephanie's attempt to smooth things over are not working. So we don't know yet if Stephanie needs Terry to forgive Morelli in order to get what she needs. But that's something we have to wonder as we go into the scene. And the stakes for this opening are actually very low, and that's fine. Most of these, the stakes have been high, but in this case, it's really the humor that's pulling us further into the scene. We probably like Terry a little bit because she's not willing to give Morelli the benefit of the doubt. We like Stephanie a little bit more because she's looking at her friend being really kind of grouchy and mean-spirited, and she's kind of rolling with it. And that tells us something about both of those characters. And it's kind of funny the way it's written. And that's what pulls people in. So humor, we didn't list a humorous opening, one of those types of suspense hooks, but anytime you can do one of these with humor, if it's appropriate to your story, that's a way of pulling the reader into the scene. This is from Paula Treick DeBoard's The Drowning Girls. Phil came around noon, spotted with tan spray paint. He entered through the garage and undressed in the kitchen, kicking off his shoes, peeling off his shirt and pants and socks. He tossed the socks in the direction of the trash can. one missed, sliding wetly to the floor. And this is actually a very economical scene opening. It immediately indicates that Phil has had some sort of a problem. You don't usually walk into the house and immediately start getting naked in the kitchen. Looks like maybe he's kind of a mess. He's spotted with paint. His socks are so wet that they slide wetly to the floor. So he's been walking around in some muck, or maybe he got tossed into some water. And also, you know from the context, if you've read the previous scene, that his wife is the person describing this. So he's coming in, obviously not in a great place. He's a mess. He's like so eager to get out of his clothes. He's taking them off the kitchen, and she's just watching him. So that tells you something about both of the characters and where they are with their relationship. So in terms of the orientation, we know where we are. We're in the narrator's kitchen where she's watching her husband take off his ruined clothes. And the point of view character is Phil's wife. And that's not obvious from this opening, but because there was a scene before, it's obvious from context. The suspense hook, this is the starting at the beginning type. We're not starting in the middle of the fight they're gonna have about whatever Phil's been up to. We're starting right when he comes home and she notices that there's a problem. And we have to wonder the questions it raises. What kind of a mess has Phil been cleaning up? Did something go wrong on some project he was working on? What's he gotten into that he doesn't want her to know about? Because he didn't come in and tell her what happened. He just came in and started taking his clothes off, even though she's right there in the kitchen watching him. So the emotion in this is a little bit of anticipation, and that anticipation quickly turns to dread. When we see the spotted with tan spray paint, we're like, oh, something, he's been painting, he's been messing around with things. And then as he takes the clothes off very grimly, that immediately becomes dread. It's obvious from the way he's getting undressed and that he's not talking, that something bad happened. The conflict, Phil clearly isn't in a great mood. He's not greeting his wife. His wife's not helping him get cleaned up. Even if you haven't read the previous scene, if you know that it's Phil and his wife in the kitchen, you know that they're probably about to have a not great conversation. There's probably going to be some tension there. And what are the stakes? At this point, we know that it's their relationship. Maybe they're going to have a fight. It could be worse depending on how Phil got so messy and what that's going to mean to the wife. So the stakes could get raised. And this is another one of those where we're not setting the stakes really high right when the scene starts, and that's fine. As long as that dread that the author has created is enough to make the reader curious and wondering what Phil's been up to and how his wife's going to react to it, that's great. You've got the reader hooked with that curiosity and they'll keep reading. So even though stakes are going to be in every opening, they don't have to be high. So don't panic if you've got some scenes where the emotion of the scene dictates that things are maybe a little bit low key at the beginning and maybe you're going to build to something. That's perfectly fine. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of these openings. Even though the scenes they were in have a structure, and this was just the opening of a bigger scene, these little openings all had their own structure too. The first lines all have something in common. Killing her would be too kind. Gray cradled the girl in his arms and hurried across the front yard. Kell couldn't stop the blood. There was once a poor man and he had a daughter. There could be a perfectly good explanation for the Terry thing, I said to Mary Lou. And Phil came home around noon, spotted with tan spray paint. And the thing that these all have in common is they immediately introduce or imply some sort of conflict. A poor man who has to take care of a daughter, that implies that there's going to be some conflict, some struggles, some problems, some obstacles to overcome. Kell couldn't stop the blood, definitely a problem there. Gray cradled the girl in his arms and hurried across the front yard. The fact that he's carrying a kid and hurrying implies that there's a problem. Killing her would be too kind. Something has definitely gone wrong there. There could be a perfectly good explanation. Even though Stephanie is trying to make things better by saying this, it kind of implies that there's going to be some sort of conflict because there might not be a good explanation and it could be a problem that there isn't. And then Phil coming home around noon, spotted with tan spray paint. It's very subtle, the conflict. And it's just like, it's weird. It's like that detail that's a little bit off that you're like, well, why the hell is he covered in tan spray paint? And it's not a big deal. It's not something that makes you immediately say, ooh, something's wrong. But it does introduce that conflict that is going to be expanded on in the rest of the scene by letting you know that Phil's been up to something. So let's look at the last lines of each of these openings. The furniture was white as well, but the focal point of the room was the enormous four-poster bed on which my sister sat, dressed in white knee-length bloomers and a loose shirt, legs crossed like a yogi, smiling like a fucking idiot. Who could do this to a child? And the problem was catching up. But they were people of account, make no mistake about it. And in the past, his reputation was well deserved. One missed, sliding wetly to the floor. And again, these are all very different types of openings with different emotions, but the one thing that these last lines all have in common is that they escalate the stakes and they express an emotion. As soon as we hear that the sister is not described as smiling, she's described as smiling like a fucking idiot, which implies that the other person in the room, the narrator, has just gotten more angry. Who could do this to a child drives home that horror and shock that this little kid has been poisoned or made ill. And the problem was catching up. That kind of implies that whole fear of pursuit. But they were people of account, make no mistake about it. There's pride in that statement, and also you can just kind of tell that, like, clinging to that idea that you're a person of account, even though your situation doesn't reflect it, that's going to cause more problems for you. And in the past, his reputation was well deserved. Again, they're just reminding the reader, hey, if people think Merle did something bad, he probably did. And then again, this last one is very subtle. One missed, sliding wetly to the floor. And that adverb wetly is incredibly important here, because if we had just said one miss sliding to the floor, it's like, he missed the trash can. But that it slid wetly to the floor is a little bit ominous. You get this picture of this sock kind of sliding down the side of the trash can in slow motion. It's a small detail that kind of amps up tension. You're like, okay, how did his socks get so wet that they are actually sticking to the side of the trash can? What the heck is he been up to? So, and in the middle of this, we have the first line that implies conflict and the last line that's escalating stakes and expressing an emotion. And in the meantime, in the middle of each of these scene openings, the author did something to kind of take you on a little journey and kind of develop the situation so that you understood where that conflict was going, or so that you understood what the stakes were going to mean, and develop that emotion so that when you got to that last line that had emotional impact, you're already ready for it. Okay, so that concludes the information that I have prepared for you. You guys you guys asked a bunch of questions. And Beth, if you don't mind, I thought maybe together the two of us could tackle some of these questions, because I know you're going to have some really great thoughts too.
Absolutely, yes. And can you hear me okay?
I can.
Absolutely, great. And thank you so much for going over that, and thanks to everyone for sending us questions ahead of time.
Yes. Okay, so the first question Tammy asked, are there any tips for crafting the opening scene in the first chapter? And I knew we were going to get this because we're only doing middle scenes, and we're doing that for a very specific reason. The opening scene in the first chapter of your book, the very, very first thing that the reader sees when they open your book, those first few lines, in addition to doing all the things that a scene opening has to do, they also have to immediately introduce someone that the reader can attach to. They have to immediately set the tone for the whole book. That opening of your very first scene in your story has to tell the reader, and this is the kind of story you're going to get. It makes a promise to the reader. It also kind of has to do a little bit better job of orienting the reader, because the reader hasn't spent any time in the story world yet, so you have to let them know this is the kind of story world that you're going to be spending time in. And did you have anything else on that, Beth, that you wanted to point out?
It's something that you mentioned earlier, that you are also establishing like tone. So if this is a funny story overall, you want to give us that hint right away. Or if it's a run for your life type story, where we are going to be anxious a lot, you want to establish or hint at some kind of ominous something. So the opening has to do a really clever job at that tone as well.
Absolutely. It's like you want to have your story has a predominant emotion, just like scenes do and scene openings do. And you should telegraph that with your very first scene so the reader knows this is going to be my emotional experience. Okay, Christophe asks, what differences between chapter and scenes? Why a scene should respect the unity of time and place? A long time ago, it was for a play, and Shakespeare did not respect it. And my guess is that for a scene, it's a rule you can break too. And that's absolutely right. Most of the definitions of scene that you see in books on how to write, they're rooted in that dramatic tradition. In theater, a scene is a length of action that happens in one place and one time. And the time between scenes are scene changes where they're changing the backdrop and having characters go on and off stage, or maybe they're having an intermission. And it's a very practical thing to have scenes in drama. In fiction, it's a lot more fluid. It's up to you to pick sequences of action that take your reader on a little journey. Every scene, we talked about it having the same structure as a story, where it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And even if the characters do not change location, if you write to an escalation of conflict and you reach a climax and there's a tense moment that would be perfect to break on, absolutely break it. And like we saw with the Stephanie Plum story, you can immediately pick up the next scene right where the last one left off. The point of the scene break there is not to say, hey, this sequence of action is over. The point of the scene break there is to give you like a little emotional jolt and give you like a little mini climax within the sequence of action before we move on to the next sequence of action and a mini climax there. So did you have any thoughts you wanted to add, Beth?
Yeah, I would say that there are conventions in each kind of genre. So if you're writing, for example, epic fantasy, where readers are expecting kind of long chapters, a chapter might contain multiple scenes, and that's very satisfying to the reader. Versus if you're writing thriller, where a scene is a chapter, and that is for pacing and keeping us at the edge of our seat, and it works really well. So every genre has kind of its conventions, and then I would just underscore what you're saying, that it's about keeping us in suspense. And I guess the final thing I would add is, even a chapter, you want there to be a sense of, you want the reader to wonder what's going to happen next. And so the break serves kind of a sense of anticipation, but also a little breather, a psychological or emotional breather. And again, something to pay attention to when you're editing, thinking about your reader. What will they be expecting? What will maximize their pleasure, and keep them also in your story world?
Oh, I love that. That is so true. Thank you. Okay, Susan asks, how much should a scene opening build on the ending of the previous scene? And we saw in some of these examples that sometimes scene openings do, and sometimes they are completely unrelated. And that's okay. You just need to think about the needs of your story. Do you need to build on the ending of the previous scene? Is there some fallout? Like, for example, if you end the scene on a cliffhanger where like the characters are opening a closet and a dead body falls out, yeah, the next scene is definitely going to build on the ending of that previous scene because everybody's going to be freaking out about the dead body. But on the other hand, if a month has passed between one scene and the next, you might not need to build on the previous scene at all. So it's really, in my opinion, a judgment call.
And I'd like to also say that if you're writing a book with multiple point of view characters, that you may purposefully not want to build as a way to keep people in suspense and shift point of view, shift location or time, as itself a form of keeping us in suspense. So it's you want to always keep an eye on what is going to be exciting to the reader and also not too frustrating, because we don't want to string them along forever. So you do need to create some satisfaction, enough, answer a few of the questions that are raised in the previous scene or a few scenes ago, depending on, again, on the kind of pacing you want to create, the kind of emotion, that overall emotion that we touched on earlier, being respectful of that.
Yes, and I just love what you just said about it being about the reader's experience, not about like the writer's experience, because we all have this idea of how the story unfolds. But if your reader is going to be best served by breaking up a big action sequence into several scenes, you should absolutely do that. Like, don't worry about the rules. Worry more about how the rules serve what you're trying to give the reader as an emotional experience, and break them when they don't. Carol asks, how important is it to start off each scene with a bang, a leading sentence that compels the reader forward? Is it supposed to answer the cliffhanger from the last chapter? And of course it can, like we talked about, it can answer the cliffhanger from the last chapter. I think it's crucial to start the scene off with a suspense hook. And I think that's a little bit different than a bang. Like we saw, a couple of those openings had very quiet beginnings, like there once was a poor man and he had a daughter. That's very quiet. There's no bang there. There's just this subtle implication that, oh, here's a guy who's in less than ideal circumstances, and so is his daughter. Or the one about Phil entering the kitchen with spots of tan spray paint. That's very, very quiet. There's no bang there. So instead of thinking about starting the scene off with a bang, I would really encourage you to think, how can I start the scene in a way that makes my reader curious? And that's why those 10 suspense hooks are so good for starting scenes, because they give you a chance right away to get the reader's emotions and curiosity engaged, and then you have time to develop things a little bit. If you looked at the middles of all those openings, they didn't bang either. They were a little bit slower, but the first sentence set the context so that you were interested in how things were unfolding, or what the context was of that first sentence. So curiosity is really way more important than a bang. Of course, if you can open the scene off with a bang, sure, go for it.
Yeah, great. I think you covered it really well.
Thanks. So Anne asks, is there a conflict between beginning in the middle of the action and orienting the reader so the beginning is comprehensible? And I touched on that a little bit with how to know if you started too soon or too late. It's not a conflict so much, it's just a balance you're trying to keep. You want to make the reader curious enough that they have to find out what happens next, but not so curious that they're just like, I'm confused, I think I'll go do something else. And the more general question, must every scene have a problem that seems insurmountable, a crisis, a big decision with consequences, or do smaller dilemmas and ahas keep readers reading? And of course, you want both. Different scenes, some of them will have huge problems, some of them will have smaller dilemmas. You could have a scene where the entire dilemma in the scene is the character's boyfriend having a tell, and she realizes that he's been lying to her about something, and they could not have a fight. It could just be that little realization of like, oh, he just lied to me about that. What else has he been lying to me about? And I'd like to tell students that every scene has to have a shift, and it has to have a surprise in it. And the surprise is almost always linked to the climax or the crisis of the scene. But it doesn't have to be big. It just has to be meaningful to the point of view character. So even if it's something very small, if it changes the point of view character situation, then it's a change. It counts. It counts as a surprise. So Beth, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I'd just like to underscore that and remind people what you said at the beginning, where a scene needs to be ending with yes, but, or no, and. And so the shift is, I love reminding, and that you reminded us that the shift can be small or it can be big, depending, of course, on where we are in the story and what, again, the reader expectations. And most stories are going to build. So towards the beginning of your book, you're going to have smaller problems and they're going to lead up to bigger problems, usually. Some stories, of course, start with really huge problems, but also readers are going to expect even greater problems. So there's always an escalation of problem. And right. And then lastly, we don't want to fatigue our readers with always having the same kind of problem, because then it becomes repetitive. And so we want to keep it varied and keep them on their toes. So the dilemmas are also need to change because of that.
That is such a great point. And also, I just want to kind of point out what you said there about like giving the reader a respite sometimes. It's like you can't have a roller coaster if you're always going up. You have to have some of those small moments. You have to go down, you have to get to the bottom where the roller coaster slows a little bit and everybody catches their breath before they start climbing again, and they know like, oh no, here comes another one.
That's a wonderful metaphor.
Thank you. Okay, Len asks, I love in a movie when one scene ends with a veiled, mysterious, or indirect mention of someone who then immediately appears in the next scene almost as if summoned. In a romantic comedy, for example, and yeah, that happens a lot there. Also in thrillers, a lot of times we'll cut to a guilty party or someone who's behind what's going on. But in a romantic comedy, for example, the lonely main character's friend might ask, whatever happened to that guy from Idaho? And then we cut to a whitewater raft piloted by, yeah, we know it's the guy, even if we don't know his name. It's a powerful, if often more subtle than in my example technique in a film because of delivery, if not the setup is entirely visual. And I wonder if there are tips or tricks for making that work especially well in written form. And I think you nailed it there. The trick is subtle. You want to give the reader just enough of a hint from the description of the person when people are wondering what happened to him or mentioning what happened to him, just enough detail that when we cut to that character, there's this one telling detail in this anonymous character or this character we haven't met before, where the reader can make the connection. Oh yeah, it's the guy in the blue suit, or oh yeah, this guy is driving a neon green Mercedes, and the guy that ran them over was in a neon green Mercedes, right? So you want to give the reader a chance to make that connection themselves, but the more subtle you can make it, the better it's going to work.
I feel a little bit distant from this kind of writing right now, since I'm writing 4 books and all in one point of view. But I in previous books where I've written from different points of view, I see using this kind of thing almost like allowing different characters to view the same thing to get a fuller picture of it. So I'm actually not, I don't really use this technique. I feel like I can't quite give a great example, but I understand how the benefit could be creating a kind of fuller picture of somebody, of a third character, for example.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I wasn't really thinking of it until you said it. But I have seen stories where they'll use it, like they'll introduce a character who's going to be really important later as very trivial with very few details. And then he shows up as a point of view character later on. There's that one detail that lets you know, oh, that's the guy they were talking about like 10 chapters ago. He finally showed up. It's a great way, again, it's a suspense hook, right? It raises curiosity. It's like, why is this guy back? How did he turn out to be important when he seemed so trivial before? So Clara asks, I tend to have trouble passing from one scene to the other. How do I start a scene in a way that's meaningful and conveys the passage of time, change of place, change in general from the last scene to the new one? And we sort of covered this, but I included this question. I think, Clara, you might have some tools right now for doing that. But I also want to introduce the metaphor of passing a ball. It's like each scene is passing the reader on to the next scene. So the ending of the previous scene is going to pique the reader's curiosity, and it's going to give the reader a strong emotion. So you want to think about how you can open that next scene in a way that enhances the reader's emotional experience. And let me give you an example of how this doesn't work sometimes. There's a book that I'm not going to give you the author name or title that I read years ago that it really bothered me, and I was almost at the climax of the book when I figured out why it bothered me. Is the main character was someone who was really mad about something that had happened in her past. And she would have these incidents in certain scenes that brought that up because she was having to deal with somebody from that past incident. And she hated him. She was so mad at him. But she would end one scene where the character was just feeling mad. And then in the next scene, that person would be in the scene, but the character would be fine again. There was no continuity. Emotionally, it was like the character was schizophrenic. She was like, last scene, I hate you. This scene, I'm fine with you. Maybe by the end of this scene, I'm starting to hate you again. Next scene, I'm fine with you. And she would just, it just felt very schizophrenic in terms of like, well, does this person really hate this character? Or is she just flipping back and forth and playing hot and cold to throw him off guard? And I don't think she was, because there was no benefit the character was getting from having him having to deal with her. I think the author just really was not thinking about the fact that if you end the last scene mad, the reader is still mad with the character, or she's still in that place of anger, and an emotional shift hasn't happened for the reader. So you want to think about how you're going to use that, either to bring the anger over, or to show that time has passed and that there's been a reset so that we know why the character is no longer angry. Or maybe even to use it as use the disconnect to your advantage. Like maybe in the last scene the character was grimly determined, and in the next scene it opens with her freaking out about something, and that tells us, oh my god, this thing that we were sure she was going to do because she was grimly determined, it must have gone horribly wrong. Now I have to keep reading and find out why. So thinking again what Beth was saying about reader experience, how is your reader going to be moved from scene to scene, and how are they going to feel at the end of a scene? That could help you decide how you want to start the next scene, because you can't just ping pong the reader back and forth between emotions and hope that they'll just go with it. You have to have an emotional logic to your story that shows characters progressing through their emotional experience so the reader can progress with them.
Yeah, I agree. And I love that example of like what not to do. One of the things I do when I'm editing is I really try and step into my character and feel what they've experienced up to this point. And like say at the beginning of the book, you need to know what happened before that. And then as you write the story, or as you have to edit the story, you want to know those little emotional shifts that we mentioned, how a character might just change a little bit from scene to scene, or maybe a lot, and to keep track of that so that we aren't repetitive, or we aren't making our characters schizophrenic. And there's ways I think too that you can convey the passage of time, like you shared, I forget which of your 10, where you might say, in the last 4 months. So it was your gymnastics example, where you give a summary and that moves us through time. And then also the reader is waiting. We're anticipating to drop into a time and place. And if you can connect with your main character, how they feel now compared to how they have felt previously. As you, as the author, you're in charge of keeping track of their change.
So true. And I love that technique of like putting yourself in the character's place at the end of the scene. That's really awesome.
Great. Do we have any more questions?
I think we have 1 or 2 more questions.
Oh, great.
Janet had a couple questions. She said, 1, what is the best way to find your first line hook for each scene? And actually the exercise I suggested, like use all 10 of these suspense hooks and see which one works for you. See how you can open your scene with each one and then pick the best one. In a scene, when is a good time to introduce backstory for character description? You want to introduce as little backstory as you possibly can while still keeping the reader up to speed. Backstory is almost never good in the opening of the scene. If you can find a way to weave it through the middle of the scene, that's much better. And remember, you're going to want to end your scenes on suspense hooks too. So you don't want to clog the ending of the scene up with backstory, because then the scene doesn't end with any sort of emotional impact, and it doesn't drive the reader into the next scene by raising curiosity, unless you can find a way to reveal something interesting about the backstory, or raise a really interesting question about the backstory that's going to keep the reader guessing or wondering. There are a lot of techniques for introducing backstory for character description. There are the techniques of indirect exposition, and there's a lot of them. We won't have time to discuss them. But if you want to think about description, you always want to incorporate it into the action of the scene. So don't describe, I can't remember who said this. There's some author that's famous for saying, don't describe things, describe things in action or things in motion. So you always want to think about, like, don't describe the character's hair, describe the character's hair blowing in the wind and getting in her face. Or don't describe a car, describe a car screeching around a corner or pulling up to the curb, or find some other way that it makes sense for you to mention the character description in the action of the scene. I hope that's helpful. And if it's not enough information, please feel free to email afterwards and I'll try and go into a little more depth, because you could write a whole course on just how to use backstory and character description in a story. And the third question was, I noticed when reading books, the author seems to go into detail about things happening in the story that are like sidebars, but really doesn't add to the main storyline, although it may be a small part of it. It just seems like rambling chatter when the author provides a lot of description of location, activities, or things. For example, I read a book that was about a court case, but spent a lot of time talking about recipes, like in a sidebar. And at what point is this appropriate? And is this something that's an author's choice? It's always an author's choice. I think, again, what Beth was saying about thinking about your reader's experience, that author that we were talking about that inserted a bunch of recipes that felt a little bit rambly to you, that author was not thinking about your experience, or she was thinking about another target reader's experience, because different readers expect different things. You cannot get away with that in a thriller. You can totally do that in a cozy mystery. And if you do it in a personable or funny or interesting way, some readers will love it. So you want to know your audience, you want to know your genre, and also you want to understand how those sidebars or the extra descriptions, or the extra side stories, how are those going to affect your reader, given what your reader's expectations are for the story and the genre.
I think you covered it. I really don't have anything to add here. And just to underscore that it's really about the reader experience when we're editing, and for the author, for us to really hone in on that and hone in on a reader, a kind of reader. Maybe this court case story with recipes was aimed for people who love the legal stories mixed in with cooking recipes, because that was what the author was aiming for. And maybe there's a niche for that. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. And I know that culinary mysteries are a thing. So if you're writing a culinary mystery, go check out some books in that genre and see how often the author does it. Go talk to a few readers who like those authors, and just do some market research to try and get a feel for how much is going to be appropriate for your genre. And of course, anytime you can get a reader who is your target reader to look at your story, the advice they're going to give you is golden on that. And I think this is our last question. Odelia asks, I have a hard time determining if a scene is necessary in the novel or not. And this is a fantastic question. Every scene in your novel should do at least two things. It should advance the story, and it should reveal character. And by advance the story, I mean the scene should depict something meaningful changing for the characters. If nothing changes in a scene, if the characters are in exactly the same situation at the end of the scene as they were in the beginning, that scene is probably not necessary. Now, I just want to add like a side note there. If the characters tried something and it didn't work, and they're stuck in the same place they were before, that is a meaningful change because they have ruled out one possibility or one option. But if they haven't ruled out any options and nothing has changed at the end of the scene, even if there's a lot of conflict, if people are having a fight that doesn't go anywhere and this just feels very repetitive and stagnant, that's not enough to advance the story. That fight needs to change things. Now, it could change things. It could be that the character's like, I tried to convince my husband that we were going to take salsa dancing, and he is just being very stubborn about it, and he refuses to budge. But then that changes something, because then she knows she's going to have to work a lot harder in order to change his mind.
I agree. That's Every scene needs to do work, and if it's not, then we need to cut it, which I know is hard, but we have to.
So true. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of tea here and kind of recover my throat a little bit. Beth, would you mind giving us a summary of the 10 common types of scene openings?
Not at all. So Bonnie today covered these 10 most common types of scene openings. And remember, she said that these are not the only 10. There can be more, but these are 10 that she covered today. So number 1, starting at the beginning of the action. Number 2, an opening could be in medias res. Or number 3, you can link to a previous scene. Number 4, summary of previous or intervening action. Number 5 is setting up a big promise. Number 6 is opening with setting in action, preferably impacting a character that we will come to know or already know. Number 7 is introducing a character. Number 8 is dialogue, and again, dialogue with our important characters usually. Number 9 is some kind of observation, usually funny, philosophical, or wise, or perhaps ideally a combination of these. And then number 10 is opening your scene with a type of zoom in, and she showed us a few examples of those. Great, so Bonnie is here today also to share with us her fantastic course, Manuscript Magic, which will help you take any manuscript from good to great. And when Bonnie was sharing her course with me, she let me know that she walks the writer through 3 levels of editing. So Bonnie, how did you come up with those 3 levels of editing?
Well, thank you, Beth. And it's kind of a story. When I was a new writer, I remember I had my first novel. I finally finished it. It took me a year and a half to write it because I had no idea what I was doing. I was just kind of trying to pants it, and I had never taken any writing courses. I'd read a couple books. So I sat down when I finally finished it. The next day I printed it out. I was so proud, and I got all my colored pens, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat down and I started editing, and I knew I needed to edit it. I knew it wasn't going to be perfect. And so I'd go through and I'd change a word here and rewrite a sentence there. And it took me a few weeks to go through the entire draft and make all the changes that I could see needed making. And so I typed them in and I printed out a new draft, and I thought, oh, I'm just going to read it through one more time before I send it off to agents and editors. And Beth, you're probably laughing right now. As I read it through a third time with all the changes that I'd made, I just got more and more dismayed because I realized that I had fixed the wording, but it was still a terrible story. It was really bad. And I thought, okay, now I need to figure out how to fix all these problems. I have no idea how. I was completely overwhelmed. And I actually had a point where I set it aside and I thought, maybe I just can't do this. Maybe I'm not meant to be a fiction writer. And I was so frustrated because professionally, I was a technical writer and editor. I had no problem editing each other's or other people's work. I had no problem editing the technical manuals that I was writing. And I thought, at the time, I thought, I'm a pretty good editor. I should be able to do this. And so I asked myself, why is it that when I'm writing and editing nonfiction, I don't have any problem seeing what's wrong, and it's very easy for me to fix, even if I have to rewrite sections and move things around. And I realized that I had been trained as a technical editor to take things in steps and to focus on one level of the document at a time. There was like kind of the big picture level where I was looking at the structure of the document. And then there was the intermediate level where I was looking at the content of the document. And then there was the language level where I was looking at the fine details of how it was written and how it could be written better. And I realized I could do this with fiction. If instead of looking at this manuscript that was like 450 pages and trying to figure out how to fix everything at once, I could just start with story structure. I could just start and looking for plot holes, and I could just go through and say, okay, is there anything really big that is a problem? Like, are there scenes in here that are so bad I need to throw them away? Is there stuff in here that doesn't make sense? When I look at story structure and then I look at what I actually wrote, how far away is what I actually wrote from any kind of story structure? Like, do I even have a climax? Do I even have any revelations, or do I have any points in here where the antagonist really goes after the protagonist? And so I started going through all my books of craft, and I started making myself little checklists for each level of editing, looking at the structure of the story, then looking at the scenes, which was equivalent to the content level of a technical document, and then looking at sentences. And all of a sudden, I started being able to see these specific problems and to fix them. So I kind of had a revelation that if I broke editing up the way I broke it up as a technical editor, I could actually just focus on a small part of the story at a time and figure out what was wrong with that and fix it. And that was the genesis of this class.
Wonderful. I really like how you brought your knowledge and understanding from nonfiction and then applied it to help you improve your editing your manuscript. That's wonderful and so useful. And so you're going to share with us more now about Manuscript Magic?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to take you through some of the cooler aspects of it, just to kind of give you a little bit of a flavor.
Wonderful.
One of the things, like I said, I learned when I edited my first novel was that the sentence level revisions are what most beginning authors think of as revision. And they're going through and tweaking word usage and adding another verb and taking out a passive tense instance. And they're not really looking at the fundamentals of the story first. And even so, it's easy to skip some of the sentence level stuff because there are so many things that can be wrong with your story when you've got a rough draft. And it can just be overwhelming. You can just, when you're reading and you're not looking for one thing at a time, you could be focused on one type of error and miss another type of error. And so many of my students, like I was when I first started to try revising, are asking the question, how can I revise my manuscript on the story, scene, and sentence levels if I don't even know how to identify those problems, let alone fix them? And this is the question, or this is the problem that Manuscript Magic is designed to solve. We're going to focus on revising. It's a system, but each of the 3 levels is going to be addressed in 3 simple steps to fix your manuscript's problems. We're going to do a checkup, we're going to do a diagnosis, and then we're going to fix that particular type of problem in your whole manuscript so that you don't have to ever feel overwhelmed by the fact that your manuscript is terrible and you don't know what to do with it. Or maybe it's awesome, but there's some really niggling thing that's off and you just can't put your finger on it. So step 1, I've designed questionnaires that ask you questions about your manuscript. Those questions might be subjective, like how do you feel the opening is? Does it feel slow to you? Because there are things that if you're a reader, you pick up on that. You might not know what's wrong with your story's opening, but you know it feels slow because it feels slow to you as a reader. And some of the questions are more objective. They'll ask you if you have certain types of grammatical constructions, or do you have a couple paragraphs of explanation at the beginning of a scene. And there are objective flags that you can use to identify that there might be a problem. So the questionnaire covers both of those types of methods of evaluation of your manuscript. Once you've answered the questionnaire, everything you answer yes to is indicating a potential problem. So then you're going to look at a diagnostic tool that I created, and I'm going to show you that in a second, that helps you figure out what the specific problem is, because the questionnaire just identifies red flags. And then once we see the red flags, we want to go like, okay, what are the potential causes of this kind of red flag? And then step 3, there are videos in the class that explain to you exactly which techniques you need to use to fix very specific problems which you've identified. So I just like to give you a little glance at the questionnaire and this process. So if I'm looking at a story and I answered yes to question 3, the opening of my story spent a lot of time explaining who the main character is and what their personality traits are. And that's a big red flag. It's a sign that I might have not done a skillful job of introducing that backstory that we were talking about when we were answering the questions. So then I go and I look at the diagnosis tool, and the diagnosis tool indicates what the specific technical problem might be that the red flag is identifying. And that is, I might have bogged my first scene down with too much exposition. So there's a solution in the course. If you have heavy-handed exposition or you have a big info dump in your story, you can go watch just that one video. You don't have to have taken the whole class yet. You can just watch that one video, and in that video, I will give you 15 techniques of indirect exposition, and then you can just see which technique works for the first scene of your story and say, okay, I have to let the character know that the reader know that my character is an orphan and that she's mad at her boyfriend and that she's really tall. And then I can go find the 3 techniques of indirect exposition that I'm going to use to weave that into the action of the story. And so then there you go. There's the exposition video within the classroom, and Beth is going to give you a glimpse into that later in terms of what the classroom looks like and what everything is covered. But the point of this is that instead of being overwhelmed and trying to look at your whole manuscript at once, these questionnaires and the diagnostic tool are going to help you focus on those niggling feelings that something is wrong in specific parts of your story. And then it's going to point you to specific techniques that are going to address that particular problem once we diagnose the root cause of it. And of course, a problem can have more than one cause. So that wasn't true for this particular question, but there will be questions that you will answer that will say, oh, there could be 4 different reasons that your scene opening is a little too slow. And then there will be 4 videos. You can watch those 4 videos. You can evaluate which one you think is correct, because there's going to be examples in the videos that show it done correctly and done incorrectly. And then you know what you need to fix. So once I started editing like this and getting real specific, the checklist that I developed for myself with that first novel eventually evolved into Manuscript Magic. So I learned to do things like I went through and I learned techniques of indirect exposition, and I have my checklist of the 15 techniques. And so whenever I get to a point in the story where I did a terrible job with exposition in a rough draft, I knew how to fix it. And this is really freeing, because instead of trying to get everything right in the first draft, if you just can't figure out how to describe your character, just describe your character, put that info dump in there, and later on you'll be able to go back to the info dump and figure out how to do it in a subtle way when you're in logical mode instead of in creative mode. Because whenever we start to get stuck in creative mode and we start using logical problem solving, that throws us out of creative flow. And then you stop writing and you get stuck. And I don't want you to do that. We want to just be able to write, finish, and then edit. So those are the 3 steps that Manuscript Magic is based on, and you'll do it for each of those 3 levels. You'll do a checkup for story level problems, and a checkup for scene level problems, and then a checkup for sentence level problems, and you'll diagnose at each level, and you'll fix at each level. So you only have to do 3 passes through your draft to know that you've caught everything. So Beth, would you like to give them a look into the classroom so they can see what it covers?
Absolutely, Bonnie. Go ahead and stop share so I can take over the reins briefly.
There you go.
Awesome. One more thing.
Oh, sorry.
You gotta stop share. That's okay. There you are. Yay. And I'll turn my video on so people can see me too. Hi, everyone. Great. And I'm going to share my screen. Oh, hold on, everyone. This always happens. There's always a little bit of a technical. All right. So just while I pull up that appropriate screen, I just wanted to say that some people had to leave and were just complimenting on how extensive this was and how useful, and how they couldn't wait to apply it to their manuscript. Hugh said, Bonnie, really love this webinar. You distilled a lot of disparate ideas about scenes into a powerful presentation. I can already see how I'm going to annotate my scenes as I work on a second draft of my current manuscript.
Oh, thank you, Hugh.
That's so awesome. Great. So I am looking for number 56. We were organized, you guys. There we go. Here it is. Sorry. Okay. I am ready to share my screen with you all. All right, so we're going to take a look inside Manuscript Magic because it's just so incredibly extensive and robust. It's loading. Great. Let me know, you guys, if you can see the screen. So inside of Manuscript Magic, you're going to have a getting started section where through video, you'll understand how this course works. And as Bonnie explained, the 3 levels of editing: story, then scene, then sentence. You'll work on identifying and diagnosing your story level problems, and then work on fixes. And what I just want to point out, when you are going into a fix to help you with a problem, you are going to see a video, a few minutes long, and you can also download the MP3. Then you have a handout that helps you scene purpose checker, for example, in this case, and you can also download the PDF. After story level fixes, Bonnie will walk you through how to execute those story level edits, and then you go down to scene level, identifying and diagnosing scene level problems. And then Bonnie has fixes on that, and there's lots of parts of scene level. Of course, structure, motif, theme, symbolism, characterization, one of my favorite, dialogue, show don't tell, also another one of my favorite, description and setting problems, point of view, so important, flow, and how do you execute those scene level edits. And then she'll bring it down from, we were at story, then we're at scene, and now down to sentence level. She'll walk you through identifying and diagnosing sentence level problems, and then fixes. And here's all the fixes. For example, passive voice is one I see a lot when I'm editing other people's work. And then she'll help you wrap that up. How do you, for example, fix for writing that doesn't sing? I love that. Because good writing needs to be musical in a sense. She offers you a wrap up, and also fun thing at the end, discount links for other products that the school offers. So that is a walkthrough of this very extensive class. It's very impressive, and it can really help you understand how to fix your manuscript. So Bonnie, I know that a lot of people have said a lot of wonderful things about your, about your class. And I'd like to read a few. Pardon me, did I skip one? Yes, okay. So Emma D. Dryden, legendary editorial and publishing consultant, says, "What a gift this is to writers." That's wonderful. Natasha Wing, author of best-selling The Night Before picture book series, says, "This program takes the best writing tips and wisdom that I've seen during my 25-year career and distills them to the essentials." Bailey Coates, New York Times bestselling author of The Magical Bakery Mysteries, writes, "Goodbye procrastination and hello polished manuscript. I highly recommend this tool for writers of all genres and abilities." Oops, sorry guys. And Jane Coet, author of 36 novels, including High Risk Investigation, writes, "Manuscript Magic takes the guesswork out of revision and puts the magic back into it. It really lives up to its name." And some more testimonials. Nancy Sondel, director of the Pacific Coast Children's Writers Novel Network, writes, "Manuscript Magic takes problem areas from fizzle to sizzle. I recommend it to writers of all levels." Linda Arms White, author of the Christopher Award-winning picture book, I Could Do That, Esther Morris Gets Women the Vote. When you've written your manuscript into a tangled jumble and yourself into total confusion, do you ever wish an editor would sit with you and help you out of that literary jungle? That's what Manuscript Magic does. John Harmer, author of Tyson Goes to the Moon. "Simply awesome. I learned things about how to write books that I've never thought of. I can't recommend Manuscript Magic highly enough. You owe it to yourself to get a copy, so do it now." And Britt Malka of fictionwriterbychoice.com writes, "The only editing tool that truly solves the problems. When you follow Manuscript Magic, you're guided through your story, you find all the spots you need to fix, and you also learn how to fix them. A wonderful tool that should be in every fiction writer's possession." These are really glowing reviews for this extensive class. And I know that there's a few bonuses, Bonnie, that you're offering to our group today, because everyone here is in our VIP community. So what are their VIP bonuses if they get Manuscript Magic today?
Well, we actually put together quite a few bonuses. The first one is an interview with Emma Dryden, who is a very experienced editor who worked in traditional publishing for several decades. And she basically talks about the editing process from a professional editor's point of view and what she encountered as she worked with writers and the problems that they tended to have in seeing the problems in their own work. So it's really a fantastic interview with her to just give you kind of the perspective if you are trying to get traditionally published, like what is your editor trying to do to help you? How are they seeing what you're trying to do? How can you meet them halfway? And what can you expect from that whole process in terms of how they're looking at your story?
Wow, that's fantastic. And I understand, whoops, there is another bonus. Bonus number 2.
Bonus. There is, and this one actually, I love this one so much. This one is about how to get feedback from other people, how to find people to give you good feedback, how to tell when feedback is good, how to tell when someone's giving you feedback that's wrong for your story, how to receive feedback. And sometimes we can kind of get in our own ways a little bit. We can kind of shut down other people when they're trying to help us. The thing I really love most about this is that I participated in critique groups and worked with the different writers one-on-one and different editors. And
Sorry.
That's okay. And one of the things I did as I started getting feedback, I noticed that some feedback was really helpful. There was other feedback that was not so helpful, or it was even confusing. And I'd like to give you an example of that. I had an author who judged my manuscript in a contest once who said her main piece of feedback was, you should make your main character, who was a demon slayer, who was like an immortal, right? She'd been around on Earth for thousands of years, and her job was to guard this portal. She said, you should make your main character a doctor or a nurse and give her a dog, because everybody likes doctors and nurses and everybody likes dogs. And at first I was so perplexed by this. I was like, what? There's nothing in this story that would make it make sense for the character to be a medical professional. It's like, why did she feel like that's what needed to happen in the story? And it took me about 3 weeks of kind of stewing on it. I just could not let go of that comment. It bugged me. And finally I realized was the key to that piece of feedback was everybody likes doctors and nurses and everybody likes dogs. What she was trying to tell me was that she didn't like my heroine. She didn't like this character enough to actually read a story about her. And what I needed to do was to create sympathy and empathy for this character. But what she gave me as feedback was something that would have ruined the story. And I kind of had to spend a lot of time thinking about that and trying to figure out what is the underlying problem that she's really trying to highlight that maybe she's having trouble putting her finger on. And it's really hard to do that when you're trying to see the problems in your own story. You're trying to interpret other people's feedback. And then you have to figure out what they mean by that feedback before you can fix the story. And so what I started doing is I started noticing and writing down all the different types of feedback I was getting that was not specific or was not helpful. And then I started kind of comparing what other people were getting feedback-wise in my critique groups and the kind of feedback that I was giving people that I was starting to notice, hey, maybe I'm not giving the best feedback here either. And I started correlating the unhelpful or vague or kind of off target feedback with what I ended up actually doing to fix the problem or seeing other people do to fix the problem. And so I have in this bonus course something that's like the culmination of 17 years of working in critique groups. That's basically a translation guide. If someone says X about your story, here are the things they could be trying to tell you. So that's what this is, a course in itself that basically not only helps you find people to give you feedback or to start a group. There's some advice on getting a group started, tells you how to work with people. It tells you how to tell when someone's giving you good advice, because sometimes it's hard to tell if they're just giving you like the way they would write the story instead of what your story actually needs. And it tells you what people are probably meaning when they tell you certain things about your story that are a little bit vague or higher level than you actually need.
That's incredible, and so important in a writer's life. What a wonderful bonus. Great. And I understand there's another bonus. Bonus number 3.
There is a bonus, and some of you are going to look at this and go like, "Oh, I don't need that." It's a course that's a companion course to Manuscript Magic, where you'll basically see me take a children's 24-page picture book that has like a few sentences on each page through this revision process. If you're a picture book writer, you're going to love it. But also, if you're somebody who really needs to see the techniques in action, you're also going to love it, because if I had tried to create a course where I edited an entire novel using this process, it would have taken me another year to create it. But with a picture book, it's a really short story and it's a complete story. So you can see how each one of these techniques gets applied to a story in real time. You're basically looking over my shoulder. I'll tell you how I identified the problems. I'll tell you what my thought process was as I was evaluating the red flags, and what my thought process was as I made the changes that I made. So you can really see what this editing process is like in microcosm before you start working on a really big manuscript with it.
That's wonderful. It's a wonderful walkthrough. Great. And then I also understand there's a 4th bonus.
Yes. There's a Facebook group that Manuscript Magic members have access to. I hang out in it, and Laura, who's the executive editor of writingblueprints.com and of Manuscript Magic, she's a children's book editor who's been editing in traditional publishing for more than 30 years. And the two of us hang out in the group and just answer questions, including if you have a passage, like you have a couple paragraphs and you rewrote them using the techniques in the class to improve them, and you want to know if you did it right. We have a lot of people who are doing that. Well, they'll post the before and they'll post the after and say, did I actually make this better? Or, did I misunderstand the technique? And Laura and I will look at it and let you know, hey, this is great. Or you could also do this thing over here that would make it a little bit better. So we can't obviously look at an entire novel, but we can help you spot check and help you figure out if you're having a problem with the technique, figure out how to use it on your story.
That's really great. It's such a valuable thing to be able to get that kind of feedback in your work. Great. And then there is an extra bonus.
There's a webinar that Laura gave from an editor's perspective on how editors see these 3 levels of editing and how she sees this playing out in a lot of the manuscripts that she's edited. And it's kind of some of the stuff that you'll learn in Manuscript Magic. This webinar kind of gives you the same stuff, but from a really different perspective. So you can kind of integrate that professional editor's perspective with how the writer has to look at it in order to edit the story.
So useful to understand things from an editor's perspective, especially if you want to be in traditional publishing or work with a freelance editor. That's great.
Yes, you'll understand your own editor a lot better after you watch that video.
That's so great. And an extra bonus that discounts on all other writing blueprint products that have no expiration date, because your class lives in the Writing Blueprints school, online school.
It is. It's not my class. It's their class. I'm creating it for them as a guest instructor. And they have a lot of great courses too. So if you just happen to find something else on their site that you think is really interesting, you can get a discount on it just because you're a VIP Manuscript Magic person.
That's so great. So, and there is a final bonus for fast action. This course, we're offering people a special. And can you tell us about this fast action bonus?
Yes, there's going to be in a couple of months an Ask Me Anything webinar where Laura and I will be hosting. And you can just ask us anything about editing, anything about fiction, anything if you want to ask Laura questions about what it's like to be a professional editor or how things work in traditional publishing. Whatever you want to know, we're just going to show up and answer everything. Answer anything. You can ask us anything because we really want you not just to get a course and have some techniques. We want you to be able to implement those techniques. We want you to use those techniques. And it's so cool. We're seeing people in the group right now who are already in the class who are saying, I just finished this draft that I spent the entire last year working on, and I took it through Manuscript Magic in 2 months, and it's the best novel I've ever produced. Or we've got a couple of people who've even gotten requests from agents and editors that they've never been able to get before, because they were able to sit down and focus on editing their story without any distractions and without any overwhelm, and they knew what to look at first and what to look at second and what to look at third. So it was they could focus on rewriting instead of focusing on figuring out what was wrong.
That's wonderful. And if people sign up by Monday night, they're guaranteed entry into this Ask Us Anything event.
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. So your Manuscript Magic, if people purchase it during this replay time, they get a special VIP bundle with all of these wonderful courses. Can you tell us a little bit about them again?
Yes, and actually these are all the bonuses we just mentioned. You can buy these bonuses separately, except for the fast action Ask Us Anything, and you'll pay about $800 for all of them. But you'll get, if you're interested in jumping into Manuscript Magic while we're doing this 4-day promotion, you can get Manuscript Magic at a discount, and you'll get these bonuses included as part of the whole package.
Wonderful. It's such a deal. So now through Monday, the Manuscript Magic bundle is only $167. It's an $800 value, and it has lifetime access. Plus, if you buy now, you're going to get the massive bonus bundle. And just to remind everyone that this discount and the fast action bonus disappears Monday night, April 9th at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern. Anything to add here, Bonnie?
No. I guess the only thing I would add is that if you are already really comfortable revising a manuscript and you kind of got that process down to a very simplified, streamlined, cut and dried process, you probably don't need this. If you don't, if you're looking at your stories and going like, oh my God, what do I do next? Or if you've got like feedback from so many people that you don't even know which piece of feedback to listen to, this course is the only one I'm familiar with. We did a lot of really innovative things in putting this together to try and make it the kind of thing where we take as much uncertainty out of the process in terms of what you need to look at, because we want you to focus on just small specific problems that you can then be creative about fixing. And we want you to be able to be more creative in editing and less stressed about the whole logical side of things.
That's wonderful. That's really great. And there's no risk.
Yep. If you don't like the course, just let us know. Within 30 days, we'll refund it. No questions asked. We would rather not have you as a student than have you as an unhappy student. We have had no refunds at all. Everybody who's taken this so far has been really excited and discovered at least one thing in it that they were like, this is a problem I've been trying to fix for years, and nobody was able to show me how to do it or to pinpoint it in the right way. And I finally figured out how to fix it. So love to give you that experience. If it turns out you don't get that experience, 30-day money back guarantee.
That's fabulous. So if they buy now in the next few days through Monday, they get 15% off the original price. And this is what it looks like if they come to sign in. And did you want to put the link in the chat, Bonnie?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that now.
Great. So, everybody ready for the link? I was jumping the gun a little bit. And here it is. It's bit.ly Beth Barany. So Bonnie's going to put that in the link, all lowercase. And now we also have time for questions. I know we normally we would end pretty soon, but we are happy to stay a little bit late to answer some questions. Bonnie, there was a question that came in, and we're getting thank yous. You're so welcome, Carrie. There was a question about point of view switches.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see. Stan asks, what are the rules for changing POV from scene to scene?
That is a really good question. I like to think in terms of rules of thumb rather than rules, because there's always going to be an exception when you're writing fiction. If you change point of view, you do need to have a scene break there to signal to the reader that they are moving to another character's mind. There are a few genres, like thrillers, when you're writing in omniscient point of view, where it's acceptable to head hop. If you're writing in that genre, then changing point of views is not required, does not require a scene break. But if you're writing in deep point of view or limited point of view, you always want to put that scene break in so that the reader doesn't get disoriented by the point of view switch. And again, you can have multiple scene breaks and stay in one character's point of view if it helps the reader's emotional experience of what's going on. So I wish I could give you like a simple rule. It's not a simple rule. It's always going to be a judgment call. But again, what Beth was saying about emotional experience, if you start there and you say, if I suddenly go from this character whose head we've been in for 5 chapters, and then all of a sudden I switch point of views to another character, I better have a scene break so the reader who's been accustomed to seeing things through one character's eyes is going to be able to recognize, oh yeah, this could be a switch, this could be a new character. And I've certainly read books where the author didn't, and like I had to stop and I had to go back and I had to figure out that they'd actually changed to a new character's point of view, because all of a sudden I was seeing the world very differently from that other point of view.
Yeah, that's great. And can I jump in here with a
Oh, please, yes.
One thing that helps, especially if you're switching, so when you are switching from point of view characters, is to open the new scene with the name of that new character. And that is, especially if you do it pretty regularly, that will be a signal to the reader that, oh, instead of being in Janet's point of view, I'm now in Mark's point of view. And so you start the scene with their name, even though we don't think of ourselves usually in the third person and name ourselves. But even if you are in their deep point of view, it is a little craft technique that you can use to signal to the reader that you are now in that new point of view.
That's so important too. I had a novel when I was a new writer and I didn't know that yet. And so I had a scene where I'd put at the top of the scene in the header, I'd been like, New York, 10 a.m., Bobby, right? And then I took it to the critique group and they were so confused. And when I said, but it said in the header that that's his point of view, and they're like, I don't read those. And so you have to expect that even if you give the reader clues outside of the story, some readers will be so into the story, which is what you want in terms of reader engagement. They'll be so into the story that they just ignore the headers and everything else, just because they just want to get into that next scene and find out what's happening next.
Absolutely. I hear that all the time too from feedback. They'll skip those headers. Great. So are any more questions? Does anyone have any more questions about scene openings or scenes in general that Bonnie can answer? You'll also get a chance to email Bonnie if you have any further questions that she did not answer during today's video. And during the replay time, we're going to have this replay up with all the bonuses available to everyone now through Monday, and that's also a really great time to send us questions. You'll get email follow-ups from me and probably from Bonnie. And Irene does have a question about scene endings. Maybe Irene, you can clarify what your question is. I could just point to underscore something that Bonnie, that you said was that our scene endings need to be yes, but, or no, and make things more difficult for our main character, and we have to feel that emotion has to shift, usually in a negative direction.
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely true. And also, like you were saying about making sure that the reader's emotional experience at the end of the scene makes sense with the beginning of the scenes. Did Irene have more specific?
Yes, she was wondering about the 8 possible scene endings that you mentioned that earlier at the beginning.
Yes, that would be like a whole other webinar. So yeah. I'm sorry, I really can't go into that in depth, Irene, but it is something that I cover in Manuscript Magic. One of the things we talk about is like going through your scene endings and figuring out which ones are actually having some emotional impact and which ones are suspense hooks. And again, all these endings are also suspense hooks. Because what we always want to do is we want to raise questions to get the reader into the scene, and then we want to raise questions to get the reader into the next scene.
Great. I think she understands. Yeah.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, Bonnie, I just really want to thank you so much. I'm going to stop share so we can see each other.
Awesome.
And if I can figure out how to do that, let's see. Or actually, I think, no, I have it. Hold on, everyone. Oops. Okay. There I am. Oh, hello. Yay, there I am. I got lost in technical land. That sometimes happens. Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for showing up today, and for everyone who are going to watch this on the replay. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you so much, Bonnie. This is so enlightening about scene openings. I learned a lot, and I look forward to implementing it in my manuscript.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun. And I've never taught on those 6 functions of a scene opening before. So, and I've never taught about the structure of a scene opening before. So that was kind of fun to test that out on you guys. It's something I've been playing with for months. I really appreciate you guys showing up for this.
Wonderful. And we're getting a lot of great thank yous, and lots of people who had to leave and said thank you, and who want to apply this to their books. So I'm very grateful for that. And I just want to remind everyone that, you know, your books do change people, do impact people, do help them feel and grow. So we need your stories. We want you to bring them out into the world. Both Bonnie and I are dedicated to helping you write the best possible story that you can. So thanks again, Bonnie. And I just want to say good night.
Yeah, good night, and thanks for having me.
You're very, very welcome.